Hello everyone, and welcome to our session today on Add Item Tracking Lines using NAV BC Web Services. Joining us today is Ross Bottorf from Innovia Consulting, and we're excited to have such a fantastic turnout today. And before I pass it over to Ross to cover on this hot topic, I would like to remind you that this session is being recorded and it will be posted to our on-demand webinar library later this week for you to review and share with anyone. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those into the questions box and we will get them answered during our Q&A time at the end of our session. So now I will pass it on to Ross to kick off our presentation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Let me get my slideshow here working. So my name is Ross Bottorf. I've been a NAV developer since 2005, going through the various changes. And today we will be talking about web services, which have been around for a while. And we're specifically talking about how to add item tracking lines to sales orders and purchase orders and such through web services. And there's been a lot of documentation on the web and shared methods. One is to publish a reservation entry page, and one is to write a code unit to help process those item tracking lines. Well, I recently decided to see how hard it would be to take the current item tracking lines page, which holds temporary data. It doesn't hold data directly. When you open the page, it grabs data from different sources and displays it for the user. It can't really be used as a web service, as a page anyway. But I wanted to see how hard it was to take all that logic and convert it into a code unit. I wanted to use the Microsoft's base code to create my reservation entries rather than publish a reservation entry page, where I would have to pass the correct documentation to the user, to the developer calling the web service. And if any troubleshooting needed to get involved, I would have to check their code, make sure that things were getting passed correctly. So I decided to see how hard it would be to convert this Microsoft code into something that we could handle in a code unit. That way I could just tell the, give the developer who's calling the code unit, just here's the method, here's the function, here's your parameters. You pass me this information, and then on my end, I'll make sure that things get written correctly. So I tried that method, and I'll show it to you today. And it's basically just taking the item tracking page, the item tracking lines page, and saving it as a text file or as an AL file, and converting that into a code unit, keeping all the logic that comes with it without having to rewrite it at all. And in doing so, we do hit the validation steps that Microsoft uses, and we use the processing logic that Microsoft uses. We don't leave that up to the outside external application, making sure that everything's getting written correctly. All right. And software requirements. VS Code for NAV 2018 or later, a Dynamics NAV development client in any version that supports web services. VS Code's easier to do what I'm going to do, so I'll be showing that. You will need a Windows client or a web client, and a NAV BC license that supports development. Now, if you're doing extensions, you're good to go. But if you are, exporting objects, and you are uh, creating code units, then you're going to want a developer's license. Okay. All right. So steps for converting the page. I'll do a high level. I'm not going to go into actual, I'll do a little bit of converting a page, but I already have one made. But basically you export page 6150 item tracking lines as a text file or as an AL file, and then you modify it. You change the object type to a code unit. You convert all the page triggers to local procedures, and you remove the fields and field logic that come with the page. You do want to note that there is some validation on the fields. So you'll want to make sure that that validation logic does get included in your own code when you go to actually start writing information. And a page has global variables that come with it. It has the rec and it has the xrec. Of course, we're going to have a code unit, and we're going to go ahead and create global variables that will handle those rec and xrec variables to make sure that we still keep the same functionality that the page would. And at the end of that, then we create custom procedures. This is where our coding comes in, our custom code, and you go in, you create a method to get the item tracking, and you create a method to set the item tracking. And this is going to be from multiple places, so you might have a method for adding sales lines, then you have another method for adding purchase lines, and then adding transfer lines. Remember to use the page trigger logic when you write your custom methods, and remember to use that validation logic. All right, not ready for questions yet. We're ready for code. All right, so I've already exported my page, 6510 item tracking lines. And it's currently a page. Make it a code unit. All right, we get errors because, of course, code unit doesn't support these properties and doesn't support a layout. I've already gone through and kept track of what validation logic I needed to keep. Let's get rid of my layout. Let's get rid of my actions. Now, how much you want to support in your code unit is basically whatever's being required. My code today will cover lot numbers. I'd have to add more code to make sure serial numbers would work. Those actions that I'm erasing right now have code that goes in and makes sure that the serial numbers are generated according to the environment and how it's set up. That logic can be added to your code unit. You would just have to include it. All right, and now we have our triggers. All right, so I think you get the idea. Converting our triggers to local procedures. Code units like to have vars at the top. I'll move my vars to the top. Find those vars. Set source spec. All right. You notice that it kept, when I exported my page as AL, it kept the in dataset parameter. You can remove it. All right, so we have some errors still. We have item number, location code, it can't be found. That's because we don't have a rec variable anymore or an xrec. We can add those. What I've done is, here's my actual code unit. Let's find that var. All right. So I've added global variables. I added global rec. So I called it global rec. I didn't call it rec. And anywhere that that rec would be used, I'm using global rec. And I created xrec. Of course, this is to take place of the xrec that would come with the page. And I added a global rec for build. What I realized when, since we don't have a page anymore, we have a code unit, there is Microsoft code that will go in and get your item tracking line page ready for whatever item tracking type you're sending. If it's from a sales line, it generates a rec that tells it this is from a sales line, or it generates a rec from a purchase line, or a rec if it's from a transfer line. It'll be it'll set that up, and that's what that global rec for build is. It's just a holding rec that since Microsoft is going in and telling the system where the information is coming from, I'm storing that in my global rec for build. And I passed that around a few places. I added some other global variables here that you'll see that are on the page. That's because I want to control the XML. I'm using XML to do my set item tracking lines. I'm using XML to return when people are calling the get item tracking lines. So I'm using these new global variables just to have more control over what the XML is going to return back. Right, let me get rid of these errors. I'll go back to my page. Do some undos. All right, let's start looking at some more code here. So basically converted these triggers to local procedures, and kept it all Microsoft code. There are some minor code changes. I did add some code here to our set source spec. That's so I can set that tracking specification that Microsoft generated to tell us where the information was coming from, sales line or purchase line, and setting my global rec for build there. Let's get to my custom code. So we'll start with sales orders. I've created a custom method here to set XML for a sales line or get XML for a sales line. This method does both, depending on parameter that's being passed. If update's true, then it sets the XML. If it's false, then it returns it. And how much custom code are we looking at here? Really, all this is copy and pasting from Microsoft's existing code. I didn't dream this code up. I went to the sales line table and I looked at how it was bringing up information. I will do that. So when you click on item tracking lines in the sales order subform, it fires off this method and brings up the page. So what I did was I copied Microsoft code here and I took it over to mine. Then that code goes to the sales line reservation entry. I'm trying to show you my screen here. Code unit name. Sales line reserve. Then I copied this information and everything except for this item tracking line set source spec and item tracking line set inbound and run modal. I've created a code unit that mimics this item tracking lines page. This variable here that we're looking at in Cal is the item tracking lines page. I'm using a code unit in my code, the code unit that I created that mimics it. It has its own set source spec, just like the Microsoft code does in the page, and it has a set inbound. So let's go back. So all that code that I just grabbed from the development client is here. And here's my set source spec for my new code unit and my set inbound. All right, so if the update parameter is true, then I'm setting the XML that's been passed. Then after I set that XML, I'm updating the database. If it's false, I return the XML. And we'll just go a little bit in here. At this point, you need to worry about your triggers, your page triggers that you convert into local procedures, and your validation logic. So I'll go to this definition. Now, however you want to set your data, you might use different methods. You might use JSON. You might use temporary item tracking lines. However you want to do it. I'm using the XML, so I've got an XML port that I created that basically stores the information. It takes the XML that's being passed and creates temporary item tracking lines. I'm not using any validation logic in that XML. It's just straight data from the XML. And I'm generating my lines. So I've got in that XML, I won't go into it too much, but set the source spec. Here's where I'm passing my global rec for build. So those lines that are being generated will know that they're coming from a sales line. And I have a get records in that XML port too that then gets the temporary item tracking. Okay. And then I have some methods that start writing. So I set my global rec. And if it's a delete scenario, I delete. If it's a insert scenario, I insert. If it's a modify scenario, I modify. Now, how you want to code that's up to you. I just basically, what I did was I passed the record variable that I created with my XML port, and I compared it to an existing one. If it didn't exist, I inserted. If it existed, then I modified. If the XML didn't have a line that the system currently does, then I delete. Let's take a look at the modify. You'll notice I got some triggers here. These are the page triggers that I converted to local procedures. I want to make sure that they fire as if I'm the page. We created our page. A user goes in and they modify a record. The on after get current record is going to fire. The on after get record is going to fire. The on modify record is going to fire. In between that, I'm writing to some fields, taking my temp table, and if it's an insert mode, I have specific logic for that, and I have similar logic if it's for modify. And in this logic here, I include that validation logic that would have been included in the page had a user entered a value into these fields. And that's, now I have my code unit. So, I made it for we just covered the sales lines, but you can do the exact same thing that I just did for sales lines for your other source types. I had a requirement to do it for sales lines, purchase, transfer, purchase order, production order, item journals, requisition worksheet, any source that you can think of, you could find out how Microsoft's writing it, and you could copy that logic and bring it over to your own code unit. Let me get to the sales lines again. Just show you some other code here. Here's requisition 9. So you've set your parameters the way they need to be for whatever source. You copy the Microsoft code, tracing through the definitions like I did in development client. You could use VS Code to trace to the definitions if needed. And basically, once you have that down, you just take your methods that you created before and set your XML or set the records however you want, update your database, or get XML. Let's go to get XML real quick. And I'm using my on init because it's just like opening the page. When you open that page, the on init fires, and then the on open page fires. So when we're getting our XML, I'm making sure I fire off those triggers. And in this method, I'm also generating my XML text. And you'll notice that I'm using those Boolean variables that I created before. Some of those were already created for Microsoft to determine what elements I'm going to pass back in my XML. All right. So now let's go ahead and see how we're going to use this. So I've created my code unit. I've created methods on how to set and get. What do I do then? Well, page-based web services have the ability to be extended via a code unit. All right, and I'll cover that quick in case you don't know. We have our web services here. We have our page web service. And here I have a custom code unit that I've created. I name it the same as my page web service, and I don't publish it. And also the methods that are included in it, they have to have the record parameter for the sales header. For instance, I've got my post shipment, I've got my release, a reopen, some things that are generally used, and I also have my update item tracking. So this is the method that I would pass to the external developer. I give them the parameters, tell them how to use it, and then it comes into the system. I take the XML that they pass and I pass it to my method. All right. And then using this method then becomes available via web service. So let's take a look at that on the .NET end. So I've got a purchase order test here that I've created. Where I go in and I call my purchase order web service. I create a purchase order. I create purchase lines, and then I can get my item tracking. I can set my XML. I used XML elements and nodes to do this. You can use a string if you want to. Call my update item tracking, pass information. So this is the purchase order. We'll go ahead and run this so to make sure that I have quantity for the sales order. All right, so my first return was I went to see what was existing. Of course, nothing existed. I added my new item tracking, and here's what I added. I also have a delete item tracking method. So I fired that off, and I did a get item tracking again to see what was to make sure that my delete was working. You'll see item tracking, an empty node there. So then I added my item tracking again, and we should have a purchase order now with a purchase line that has the item tracking set. So let's go to my purchase orders. Let's close that one. go to my latest. This one right here. So here's my item tracking lines. Let's post it. Ah, all right. Now we can do the same thing for our sales order. Okay, let's go to our sales orders. Here's my item tracking. All right. Here's my item journal. And for the item journal, I just have the get after I set it. Let's go to our item journal. Okay. And I believe that covers it. I'm ready for some questions now to make sure that that you get a good handle on what I just did. It didn't take me that long. It took me more time to think of what to do than to actually do the coding. So I'll go ahead and pass this off to Angie.
All right, thank you, Ross. We do have one question that has come through so far. How does item tracking work with back orders and shipping process?
Okay, so being a developer, I might not think of back orders the way that some clients would. You know, to me, that means like partial shipments. So let's say you have a quantity of 10 on your sales order and you just have enough to fulfill, you know, a quantity of one. So you ship one. If I'm understanding that correctly, then the system should be able to handle that. So you, just like a user would, you would go into your item tracking and you would set, you know, your item tracking for that one item that you're shipping. Even though your sales line says 10, your item tracking is going to cover one. You'll set your lot number, for instance, and you'll do quantity handled of one. You'll set your quantity to ship as one, and then you ship it. Then when you go to ship another, that item tracking line is going to be there when that user opens that up, but that's when it comes from a different source. It comes from like the item ledger entry table. And then you can add new lines to handle the rest of it. If I understand that question correctly, you could code your web service. You could, in your code unit that you've created based on the page, in your custom methods, you'd have to add logic to support that partial shipping. My current code today doesn't have any examples for the partial shipping, but you can modify your code to support that. I hope that answers it.
Okay, thank you. If anybody else has any questions that you would like to ask Ross, feel free to go ahead and type those in now. And while we're waiting on that, I would just like to thank Ross for presenting today, and to everyone on today's call, or if you're watching on demand, we want to thank you for joining us. And we do have a few more webinars coming soon. Next Tuesday, August 13th, we have Notice presenting on payment processing and customer payment portal for Business Central. And then next Wednesday, we have Gino Pack from Innovia Consulting, and he's going to be presenting on 7 tips for faster data entry in Business Central. All right, and check out our website for our upcoming events, and that's innovia.com/events. And we also want to mention that we have our podcast going on. It's called the Innovia Conversation. If you have not heard it yet, you can find out about all the different podcast platforms to listen to on our podcast page, and that's innovia.com/podcast. So check out the podcast selection and subscribe to get notified when the new episodes air. And Innovia is proud to be a platinum sponsor of BCUG NAVUG Summit in Orlando, Florida this year. And those dates are October 13th through the 18th. And if you haven't already registered, or if you want more information about Summit, check out our conference page on our website, and that's innovia.com/conferences. All right, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on another Innovia webinar. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you. You're welcome.